Good evening, everyone. I'm Suraf Kumar Bисvas. I'm a landscape architect and co-founder of Sponge Collaborative. We are a multidisciplinary practice that's currently focused largely on South Asia and starting projects in Central Asia. And the reason we started this practice is because we find, and that's what the evidence tells us, is that some of the most climate vulnerable cities in the world are in Asia. And they are some of the most rapidly growing cities in some of the most rapidly warming and increasingly wet and dry places on the planet. So today I'm going to present some of the work that my team is doing. I am based in Lyon in France. My team are based in Bangalore and Chennai. We are three partners. The three of us used to work at Sasaki in Boston. And we take a lot of inspiration, obviously the name Sponge Collaborative, from the late Dr. Konjing Yu's concept of Sponge City that basically emerged from his practice and application in China. And we are basically taking that approach and pioneering it in a different context of South Asia with a team of urban planners, urban designers, landscape architects, GIS specialists, and engineers. So today my narrative will largely follow a 4-point argument. One, that our cities are facing a polycrisis. And to me, a polycrisis represents a significant challenge. We are facing a biodiversity loss as well as a climate change crisis and a quality of life crisis. And that presents an opportunity for systems thinkers like designers to introduce new approaches to solve these wicked problems. And my second argument is that nature-based solutions in this context offer a holistic way to manage all of these issues at once when designed and planned well. And my third argument is that a landscape approach, which I would say is an ecologically informed way of doing urban planning and development in general, is required to effectively integrate nature-based solutions that I will explore a bit more what it means with sustainable development goals. And finally, I will show you some of the projects that we are doing in Chennai to make Chennai a sponge city and why, surprisingly, that holds relevant lessons for Almaty in Kazakhstan. So just briefly, the different polycrises are, we have had flooding for a long time, but we are starting to see in Central Asia that we are growing into what are previously floodable areas. So the risk of flooding is increasing because of how we are growing, as well as climate change, which is increasing the amount and intensity of rainfall that comes in at a given time. But I really want to emphasize how much the role of development is in increasing flood risks, because the moment you turn green into concrete, you're increasing your risk much faster than how climate is changing that risk. On the flip side, the same places that face a flood risk can also be exposed to water scarcity risk, which is why we focused in Chennai in India, because it famously experienced a huge flood and then 2 years later almost experienced day zero. And in Central Asia, across multiple countries, any watershed in red is definitely facing high water stress, which means more water is going out of the system than going in. And our cities are getting hotter, and this does have to do with climate change. So the same concrete that used to be hot 10 years ago is now much hotter. And it's going to continue getting hotter, given that we are well on track to move past the 1.5 degree target and the 2 degree target. So what does it really mean to live in a 3 degree hotter world? It means much more unbearable summers, much less productive hours, and very dangerous impacts, especially if you are in the humid context of Indian cities. It can have a lethal impact. And then specifically for the Central Asian context, how all of these risks intersect with landslide risk. What does it mean when more rainfall falls over steeper slopes, increasing the risk of landslides? What does it mean that wildfires taking away forests are also going to increase the risk of landslides. So we are starting to see cascading risks on top of other risks, making life a lot more dangerous in cities and mountainous areas. And finally, the fact that we are seeing a biodiversity loss globally, but even more so within our cities, where we don't give space for small mammals, small birds, aquatic animals, and others to thrive and live alongside urban dwellers. And even within the rural areas that we think of as wild with pesticides, we are doing a whole other catastrophe. But we can imagine a better future together, and that's what this lecture is about. When we look at Kazakhstan and focus specifically on some of the mountainous areas and the foothills upon which Almaty rests, I'm going to introduce the concept of nature-based solutions, keeping these mountainous contexts in mind, and then slowly make my way into urban nature-based solutions and what we are doing in Chennai, taking inspiration from China. So nature-based solutions, if we define them, are actions to basically work with nature by protecting or restoring and enhancing them where possible with design. So we can do this in coastal ecosystems, in mountainous ecosystems, and we basically make sure by working with nature, we are adapting to climate, and we are providing ecosystem services like regulation of temperature, of water, and as well as biodiversity benefits. So in the Central Asia, the mountainous context, forests obviously play a very important role, and they're quite effective as well in reducing landslides. So these images are from a project we are currently doing with the World Bank, where we are trying to raise the awareness of nature-based solutions and how they can be useful to address different hazards, and in what types of landscapes are they going to be more effective as well. So not all nature-based solutions that I will show you today are effective everywhere. And so this is going to be the structure through which I kind of run you through a number of other solutions. So to start with, forests, just because of their root structure, they're able to hold on to soil when it rains. Just the fact that it's leafy reduces the runoff that rainfall generates. And so in that case, it is able to more effectively hold on to the top layer of soil, preventing shallow, rapid landslides. Trees and vegetation in itself is very effective for extreme heat. But there are some other benefits as well that the same planting effort can get you when you do them in the different mountainous and other areas. In Central Asia, rangelands, again, is a nature-based solution, which basically means if we manage our rangelands in the way that we are not overgrazing them and that we are maintaining how far livestock can grow, that they're not taking over the vegetation that's currently holding the soil, that itself can have a lot of benefits towards soil erosion and can even encourage the slowing down of water to address water scarcity issues and encouraging more infiltration by improving the soil's capacity. And there are many practices, including rotational grazing, including no-till zone working in those kind of working landscapes, but it's not as effective at landslides. So it's important to kind of really understand these aspects of where to work with nature and what hazards specific nature-based solutions can reduce. Lakes are another important, and ponds are water bodies that can go a long way in helping recharge. So instead of letting water go from the ice caps or the snow caps through your city in a concrete canal and out into another reservoir, what can we do within the city to create a network of lakes and ponds and end up creating recreational opportunities, creating habitats, but also creating more places for water to collect, store, and potentially recharge the aquifer. I keep bringing up the aquifer because the aquifer is the groundwater below the soil, the most efficient way to store water and not lose it to evaporation compared to storing water in these big dams that are very much exposed to evaporation. So the aquifer basically becomes your safety deposit for water that you can bring up later on. So every solution that helps you with water scarcity by promoting that process gets a green in our books. Rivers and floodplains, if we allow our rivers to function as floodplains, because one thing I noticed is in Central Asia, and not just in Central Asia, but many countries in general, we are very quick to channelize our rivers because we feel that's the best way to control them. And we are finding more and more that with climate change, they're not that easy to control. And in fact, we have increased our risk by channelizing rivers and building right next to them. So floodplains basically means we are letting the water move through its natural flows. And in that process, connecting with the aquifer, creating more opportunities for water to get recharged. And in that process, also making sure floodwaters are not going towards settlements and kind of the settlements have been moved away from the floodplain. So in many cases here, we might have to restore floodplains, reclaim the floodplains, and make sure settlements are no longer next to rivers. Wetlands, I think, have a big opportunity in Almaty region as small constructed wetlands or in places where water is already collecting. How can we introduce certain habitats like wetland species that are resilient to both drought and extended periods of water? And that starts attracting a lot of habitat and can be an extremely good way to tackle heat and the issue of water scarcity. Other measures that I'm sure is already happening and happens extensively in mountainous areas. But in this case, I'm highlighting more the kind of gabion walls and the structures that we build with nature that allows trees and plants to latch onto the soil more effectively in steeper areas. And also solutions where we work with the slope. And instead of, again, turning this into a concrete channel, we are actually creating within a stream places for water to hold and cascade down and potentially recharge the aquifer whenever it has the chance to stay. This is particularly effective if you have farmlands downstream. So the benefits of aquifer recharge can be seen in improved agricultural yields immediately downstream of these interventions. Within this ecosystem, when you come in, and you start applying the concept of sponsity, which means working with nature in more tight areas to manage infrastructure through a network of green infrastructure. And one of the fundamental principles of sponsity is because we have lost a lot of green cover, we have a lot more runoff from the same amount of rainfall. So if you just have a green forested area, the same rainfall generates 10%. The 10% of the rainfall becomes runoff. Almost half of it can go into the groundwater. But when you have concreted everything over, you're generating 5 times more runoff. So you're increasing your flood risk. And you have completely lost from 50% to 15%. As per the literature, you have lost that much kind of infiltration because of the concrete. So the sponsity approach, as it has been implemented in China, brings all of these benefits, including, apart from flood mitigation, reduced heat island effect, improved aquifer recharge, improved air quality, and with the introduction of vegetation in our urban environments, reduced noise pollution and many other benefits that we bring to the birds and the mammals. In a relatively dense area of Singapore, another example is how this project created a meandering river out of what used to be a concretized channel. So you can even see the remnant of the concrete channel. This doesn't work anymore, to the south. And this is a kind of a before image of the stream. And then they actively re-engineered that stream profile to create a naturalized meandering water body. And that water body is designed with a certain flood capacity, so it will fill up during a storm event. But then after a storm event, it basically becomes this very naturalized recreational amenity. And it took about just a 6-month process to go from concrete to greenery, and then over 12 months letting greenery take over to become this kind of a lush habitat. This is a project by Ramboll Dreischeitel in Singapore. And the fact that the same infrastructure can become a place for community to gather is what makes these kind of infrastructures special. So just to summarize, the Spun City approach is different from gray infrastructure because gray infrastructure is built on this assumption that the faster we let water go out of the city, the better it is for flood mitigation. But what climate change has done is it's bringing in more rainfall than our stormwaters have been designed to handle. So that approach can no longer work unless you build bigger pipes. And this approach, even if you build bigger pipes, are not going to address your lack of aquifer. So the Spun City approach is, how can we, within the stormwater network, insert places for water to collect and store and delay, which means we can do it in the form of small parks that we call sponge parks, open spaces that are designed to collect water. We can do it in the form of sponge streets, where we can install rain gardens that are, again, designed to slow down water. And what this does is whenever you have a big event that's generating a lot of runoff, we are distributing that runoff into green spaces and holding on to them. And then as the storm passes, that water gets released back into the stormwater system or into the aquifer. So you have not overwhelmed your stormwater system. You're increasing the resilience of your stormwater system by adding blue-green systems wherever you can find within the city. That means you can plant trees on your roof, turn it into a green roof. Instead of concrete generating runoff, it's green, so it's generating less runoff. Your large open spaces, instead of flat, bare soil, is now a green area that's generating less runoff. Now it has a pond, so it's holding water. Now it has a recharge well, so it's recharging the aquifer. So all of these measures together, and then working with a restored water body to make sure the overflow of a flood event can go towards that water body, together can make your system a lot more resilient. And by planting these trees, creating these rain gardens, it becomes a much more livable neighborhood. So to us, a Spun City project, especially when you lack space, but you have to pack in a lot of functions, through design, we can create these parks that are both a thriving ecosystem, but also an infrastructure that functions to mitigate flooding, capture rainwater, and we are shaping the land to move water from one part to another. Now, a landscape approach basically means that we have to do these interventions, not just small rain gardens here and there, but think about how all of it works together, and also think about the larger watershed you're a part of. Because some of the events that we are facing, like landslides or big floods, cannot be solved just by constructing these small blue-green infrastructure systems. So what we try to do in our project in Central Asia is to help people understand, when you're a city in the foothills, what are you surrounded by, and how can you plan nature-based solutions in different parts of that landscape, especially when those landscapes flood, when those landscapes have earlier melting, when those landscapes have landslides or rockfalls. And what are the things that we are doing within those landscapes which we have to change and stop? So how can we stop deforestation? How can we stop unregulated construction on the hills? How can we make sure our roads are not cutting into steep slopes? How can we limit overgrazing? Where can we limit quarrying? How can we work with aging dams and reservoirs? Where can we make sure we're not constructing over rivers and channelizing them or sand mining it? So there are many of these issues that we ourselves are creating through how we currently manage our large landscapes. And on top of that, we have to keep tracking what climate change is doing to different parts of the landscapes. Where is climate change increasing wildfire risk? Where is climate change increasing the risk of erosion and landslides? Where is climate change creating dust storms and accelerating land degradation? Where is climate change creating more extreme flooding? And where is climate change creating extreme heat island effects in our cities? And taking this into account is when we can start thinking of how our different nature-based solutions, looking at their effectiveness, looking at the suitability, can work together to increase the resilience of our landscape. So to give the specific example of Almaty, at the foothills, what is the land cover that we have in our landscape? How quickly are we transforming our forest areas into built up? How quickly are we transforming our farmlands into built up? And then recognizing what is the watershed that I'm a part of. A watershed is defined by when water falls in any of these places of the boundary that we are showing. All that water basically goes through the city and ends up in the Kapshage Reservoir. So the reason why this is important is because Almaty is downhill of many landscapes that are landslide prone. And when we talk about flood risk, you really need to consider how flood plays out within that entire watershed. And so nature-based solutions, to me, work effectively when we are able to create a network at this scale, starting from the hills, going through the city, going through the rivers, all the way until it meets the end. So what that means for the hilly area at the top of the slope is that we are able to do forestation at scale, and in steeper slopes, combine that with bioengineering. And that way we are able to hold the soil and try to prevent as much as possible landslides from occurring. In more steeper slopes, as I mentioned, we start doing more bioengineering in the form of introducing wooden frames, live branches, and other things that encourage the plants to extend their root system and hold on to the topsoil. That, complemented by other forms of hybrid infrastructure, can protect many of the critical infrastructure from rock falls. Then the gullies, which are basically the vehicles through which floodwaters come rushing in from the hills, but also the vehicles through which the greatest erosion happens. How do we work with nature to slow down that process of water moving through? By creating these kind of gully breaks and check dams, which just pull together stones and live branches in strategic areas to make sure that erosion is slowed down, and that whenever water does come in, it's slowed down and not quickly rushing through that we might do if we turn that into a concrete channel. And finally, at the end of your foothills, whether you're an exposed settlement, we could then design these kind of gabion walls and detention basins and concrete walls to deflect the energy of whatever debris is coming down your way if you're in a settlement. Or if at the foothills we are dealing with agricultural land, how we continue that system of contour bunding and farm ponds and contour terracing. All of these are basically very simple, follow the land and start digging perpendicular to the flow of the water. So you're creating more opportunities for water to collect, stay in its place, and go down into the aquifer when possible. And all of these moves collectively, very small moves, we have seen this happen in very arid parts of India as well, completely transforms how productive the land downstream of this intervention becomes. And these are very simple interventions that could be done even with the community, and it brings back vegetation. Then when we get into the city, we are looking at a city that's going to suffer from extreme heat. We are looking at a city that has already channelized its river, but there is so much potential to think of these rivers and think of the main boulevards that have a lot of right of way. Think of our buildings with green roofs and how together they can become an interconnected green system. And if we design the alignment of these systems or these corridors with the dominant wind directions, they basically become cooling corridors. So Medellin has shown this approach where they design these kind of cooling corridors by planting trees along certain axes. And they managed to cool their city by between, I think it was 3 to 5 degrees. And then as we go into the peripheries, we can start thinking of constructing these wetlands or constructing these ponds. Because as we said, as the water is moving on through your landscape, what if we created more avenues and more places for water to collect? And then they become recreational areas, but they also become additional places where water can go and recharge the aquifer and not just at the end to the bigger reservoir. And in the rivers themselves, where possible, we should try to restore the meandering nature. The reason water does this is because that's how water flows when all the sediments keep collecting. And the more we think that we can channel this by creating 2 concrete walls, by constricting the channel, it'll eventually at some point break down and cause a huge loss. Or it'll create some effect downstream. Or certainly it's taking out whatever biodiversity is currently seen in this picture. But in case we have erosion, there's also solutions like bioengineering that work with coconut fiber, that work with live stakes to achieve some of the erosion mitigating aspects within a natural floodplain. And then further down, this is not really the case within Almaty, but letting the river really meander and respect its floodplain makes you a lot more resilient in the longer run. And so this is, I would say, much downstream from the strategic watershed that I showed you. So this is how we are thinking that if you take a landscape approach to nature-based solutions, how different strategies come together at the watershed scale is what will build resilience to extreme events, not just small fixes incrementally done. Some examples from the sponge city, Chennai, that I'll bring up. And it's a bit of a contradiction to say that a city of 12 million people in just double the area of Almaty has to show Almaty. I think one reason is density is not really an issue. That even in a very dense place like Chennai, we have found opportunities to do what we are going to show you. Chennai receives more than double the annual rainfall of Almaty, but almost all of that rain in Chennai falls within a period of 4 months. And so what we get is huge amounts of rain, but most of the year we are as dry as Almaty. The other reason why I think we have something to tell each other, and Adil will take me and we'll have some lamb pulav some point, but we also have very amazing rice-based lamb specialties, and I think it's interesting to compare the both. Heredity-wise, as I mentioned, we're not actually too different because Chennai is kind of in this semi-arid, dry, subhumid region of India, which we all assume to be humid because of the monsoon, but we are not uniformly humid. So we actually share some of the semi-arid conditions as the 2 cities. The other thing that I think Almaty would take away from Chennai and could relate to is the fact that we had these very strong traditional systems of creating ponds within our semi-arid place where we didn't have snow-fed rivers, we didn't have perennial rivers, we only had rain-fed rivers. And so it was very important for farmers to traditionally build a network of ponds before a stream meets the river to hold water. And we also created our religious structures and designed these kind of pond in such a way that we knew that it had a temporal function, that during the monsoons, this entire pond could fill up. So I don't think Almaty has grown as fast as Chennai has, but Chennai is basically facing the consequences of everything I mentioned. We have concreted over hundreds of water bodies, thousands of acres of farmlands, and now we are facing the consequences of flooding every year and then also facing water scarcity every other year. And this is the case with many Indian cities throughout, where we also have the additional issue of not being able to manage our waste. But in Almaty's case, if we can solve for flooding, water scarcity, and heat, with nature-based solutions. That's what we will explore. The one thing that we have done in Chennai by focusing on it for the last 4 years is by working at all 4 scales of institutions, which means how do we change their approach and build their capacity at the government level. So at the state government level, at the urban local body level, and at the ward levels. And territorially, which means looking at the whole metropolis. In Almaty's case, this would be looking at the greater Almaty region and thinking, what do we need to do to manage growth there? And then we have projects that we do at the neighborhood scale, which means we look at a 200-acre, 1 square kilometer area, or ward by ward. We create a master plan, and that master plan defines a number of projects. And as we build the pilot projects, we take the learning from that and start building capacity using those learnings. So everything becomes a virtuous cycle, and we will show you that in Chennai, for the last 4 years, we have done 15 projects across those 4 different scales, 2 of which have been built. I will show you one of those projects here, and a number of them have been approved as part of the planning process. So following kind of this congenial strategies of writing letters to the mayor, we simply wrote a book in 2021 called The Sponge Handbook Chennai, where we introduced the idea of the sponge city and contextualize it for the city of Chennai. And that book, we made it open source, and everyone in the city got to know about this book. They downloaded it, all architecture schools started referencing it. We took it to kids to help them understand what a sponge city is. We took it to government officials multiple times until we got our first project. At the metropolitan scale, we are currently helping the city do an open space master plan as part of their development planning exercise. And here we take a very GIS-based approach, looking at what are the flood-prone areas, looking at what are the green areas, looking at where recharge can be more successful because of the soil, and using that to tell the city where not to grow, where to grow, and if you grow in these kind of green places, use certain guidelines that we have offered, but otherwise structure your growth in a way that you densify with transit on the corridors, and you have about 5 wedges to structure your growth. Then we went further, showing how you can create nature within cities by working with rivers, water bodies, canals, but even transit stops and religious areas, and how we can work at different scales, including in very, very dense areas where we even find 20,000 people per square kilometer. And with that, we came up with a strategy for organizing open space and working with the city to make sure the city works like a sponge, not just because we have built sponge parks, but because they have protected these natural green wedges that are already out there and protecting the wetlands that are already out there. The second thing that we did was remind the city that you have 5 rivers. Rivers have basins. Basins link land use to the river. And so you have to work at the mouth of the river, at the starting of the river, along the streams that feed the river. And then we come up with projects for different basins. In one of these basins, we look at a neighborhood. This neighborhood is about 1 square kilometer. And we model where in the neighborhood is there going to be flooding. And in those floodable streets, where can we create and insert rain gardens that will slow down water and not overwhelm the rain gardens. And we develop a framework for all of these different infrastructure toolkits to find its place within the urban fabric. And by doing this, we end up with a sponge neighborhood framework, where we are saying these streets, the large green arrows, can become sponge streets with a lot of rain gardens. We are showing all the open spaces that can become sponge parks. And we quantified and modeled how this network does in the event of a rainfall. And what we found is that if the city built this network without upgrading any of their stormwater drains, they can manage much more extreme events at half the cost of doing it via gray infrastructure. And then within the framework, like we usually like to do, we identify a pilot project because people need to see something to believe that change is coming. So we worked with one of these open spaces that you could find in Central Asia as well, very flat, compacted maidans, we call them in India. And they get hot. They're only used in the evenings, and they're only used to play football by a youth group. And we came up with a concept of what happens if you're able to green the amenity and provide many other playgrounds for different age groups and genders. And people were happy that they finally were getting a place, not just for the youth to play football with no trees, but a very well-shaded area with a jogging track, with different kinds of play areas. And within this configuration, we designed the infrastructure. So the idea is that all the runoff from the streets are going to go into the rain gardens. The rain gardens overflow is going to come into our park. And the park is graded, so all the blue areas get filled up during a rain event. The football ground stays safe. And as the park fills up, it starts going into the infiltration basin to the northwest corner. And when that reaches a certain level, the water goes into the stormwater drain. So we basically replicated that strategy of going from one pond to another pond to another pond within a very tight urban fabric to manage a 25-year return period storm, because that is something that we worked with hydrologists to figure out what level of storm it can manage. So here we kind of simulated what happens in a small event, in a big event, and how many days it takes for the water. And because we were modeling and quantifying all the benefits, this planning process got funding from the central government. So we are a federal country, we have a state government, central government. It got about $3.6 million of funding to do the neighborhood level interventions, and about $1 million to do this park and also monitor the benefits of this park. So this park is currently under construction, not exactly as we would want it, but still it's happening. And then finally, I will end with this project, which is the Eco Wetland Sponge Park. It is one of the largest sponge park demonstrations in India, about 16 acres large. And it used to be a dumping ground. And in about 2 years of taking out the trash, remediating the soils, restoring the water body, and building our project, this is what the project looks like in today. But just a point to note, how we change our water bodies, a secondary sewage treatment pond, which means it is receiving treated sewage water from the campus, and then that treated sewage water currently flows through this water body. And what we did was we worked with the government to take back what was the open space that the university started using as a parking lot. We started taking out the concrete from this parking lot to make it a park. We started restoring the water body to make it a wetland. And the wetland is still fed by the the treated sewage water. This was our master plan that we proposed, where we would continue to take the stormwater runoff from the campus and move it through our network of bioswales and ponds. So we are filtering the stormwater, which has its pollutants, and then taking it out into this open space where we need the university's permission to build some recharge wells, but that's the eventual idea. And then the sewage water that's treated from the university and moving through that pond keeps coming into our water body and then moves out here, where they currently have the provision for taking it for industrial reuse. And within this, we have designed a continuous boardwalk experience that is always flood-free. And we have transformed that parking lot, what used to be, into this park space. So we went from this condition, concrete here, parking lot here, trash here, weeds all over, into a new park over the parking lot, into a restored wetland, and into this network of ponds. And like I mentioned, the pond is designed to treat water by moving it through a network of 3 ponds. And because we have desilted the water body, we have created a new flood zone to absorb excess flooding whenever the extreme storms come in. So we have created a capacity of almost 30,000 cubic meters or 3 million liters of water whenever an extreme storm comes through. And whenever it exceeds that capacity, it goes into that runoff, that overflow area. So currently, this park is a flood mitigation infrastructure. We did a heat sensor study. It currently cools down from the outside to the inside by about 10 degrees Celsius on a hot summer day. And it has transformed a treated sewage water into a habitat and an amenity. And here's an aerial view of how that park works. This is where the water would go through, and there's the sewage water coming in from the north. And so firstly, this basically becomes a wetland that is an urban infrastructure, where we go from this kind of a detailed drawing to just show what are the 4 different blue-green infrastructure components that we have built. We will technically go into this within the workshop later, but for this audience, I just want to qualitatively show you what these different ponds are doing. The sedimentation ponds collects all the dirt from the runoff. The aeration ponds moves it through a shallow bed of pebbles, so it's more oxygenated. And then the phytoremediation pond has a number of wetland species, and where the roots are designed to pick up different pollutants. These are some images of the different ponds and the bioswales and other features that also have signages that explain to the visitors what each thing is doing. And I will just show you some very quick videos of how this, okay, yeah. So anyway, these are just some videos showing how through some of these blue-green infrastructures, you will find butterflies, birds. This is just after a rain event that we went. This park itself has seen a big flood event while it was getting under construction. Yeah, and so here in this phytoremediation pond, you can see that little crane. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so this is the video of how the different species in the phytoremediation pond look and the kind of wildlife it's attracting. And then the next layer is the kind of planting that we have brought into the site. We have more than 100 species of pollinator plants, of wetland plants that are working within mature trees that we didn't move. So the whole design worked around the preservation of mature trees. And now we have this extremely wild, native, tall grasses next to ornamental grasses that are still native to Tamil Nadu, next to these wetland species that are creating this kind of a nice ecological edge next to the constructed wetland. And finally, this whole wetland working as a socio-cultural amenity where we have signages that allow people to learn more about the birds that are coming in. This place has become a migratory bird site. The eBird has made it one of the new hotspots with more than 50 observed species, even before the first migratory season when it stayed open. And this is just a video of what it feels like to come into this park in the evening. I think if there was music, you could also hear that we are not too far from, the sound from the video would kind of make you, me? Okay. Yeah. So you could almost hear some of the sounds from the streets, but you can also hear the sounds of birds, different kind of birds, herons, storks, warblers, collecting on that side of the water body. And again, this is treated sewage water out of which we are creating a habitat and a place for people to gather and look over. Whereas the other infrastructure we showed you is purely open space crafted to work with stormwater. And then these play areas, one fact about Chennai and what happens in these extreme conditions is we have 0.65 square meters of dedicated park space per capita. And this park, whenever it opened, is receiving more than 5,000 visitors weekly. And it continues to be a free park for everyone to enjoy. And based on that, we basically developed a manual. This is something I'll share during the workshop with the engineers of how you do sponge open spaces or sponge parks, all the way from planning through design, through financing, through operation, maintenance, and repurposing. And we developed this quite graphically for everyone to appreciate. But we also use this to train more than 200 engineers in India, including 60 engineers within the Greater Chennai Corporation. And we organize with GIZ 2-day workshops where we bring engineers and officials from different parts of India to learn about the Sponge City concept. I gave you a very quick overview because we spend half a day just going over the participants to help them understand this concept. And then for the rest of the day, we take them to the park. Then on the second day, we assign them some sites, some open spaces within their cities, and see how they have taken those concepts and designed their own sponge parks, and with what understanding they can go forward. So again, we are looping back from planning to master planning to pilot project, and then taking the lessons from that pilot project to do more capacity building. And so the main lessons that Chennai brings to Almaty is that it's very important to engage as many stakeholders as possible to build the political buy-in that you need to center nature in your cities. And then it's important to work at all scales at the same time. There's no one scale that is more important than another, but the importance of seeing pilot projects is always there. Collaborating, at least for landscape architects, if this is a room full of planners and architects, collaborate with people outside your discipline. Or if you are an engineer, collaborate with a designer. That's the only way you're going to get better infrastructure. And finally, design with nature to help address multiple risks. As I mentioned, why and how. And it's very important that when a project is built, we have set up the parameters to measure all the benefits. So currently, we have already measured the heat benefits. This monsoon, we are going to try to document all the flood benefits and then use this to convince more and more decision makers that this is the right way to go. So thank you for your attention.